Welcome to Naked Reflections, brought to you from the Woolf Institute. I'm Ed Kessler, and each week I'll be taking an in-depth look at the stories reported by our friends over at the Naked Scientists. What does the latest scientific stuff mean for the rest of us? Stay with us and find out. If I asked, do you like the Naked Reflections podcast? It would be an open question. If I asked, what do you like about the Naked Reflections podcast? Well, I'd be nudging you in a positive direction. Nudge theory is our subject this week. It entered the political lexicon relatively recently, but the basic concept is as old as the hills. How does nudge work when it's developed as a policy tool? Placing fresh fruit at eye level by the supermarket checkout would count as nudge, but banning junk food would not. Is nudge theory a euphemism for psychological manipulation, a sort of libertarian paternalism? Or is it a practical way of improving things? Well, with me to discuss nudge theory are Dr. Beth Singler, Research Fellow in Artificial Intelligence at Hamilton College, Cambridge, and a regular contributor to Naked Reflections, and Dr. David Halpin, Chief Executive of the Behavioural Insights team. David has worked as the Chief Analyst at the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit and is author of Inside the Nudge Unit. Welcome both. Beth, as an anthropologist, nudge theory must be as old as the hills. It's not a new thing, surely.
No, absolutely. I think we see lots of different variations of this idea under different terminology over the centuries, that you can even go way, way back to how different stories and narratives and even parables shape conversations and lead people into particular behaviors. And that kind of forms a technology of its own. But now more contemporarily, we're talking about it in terms of nudges. It's a more recent term. And there's a question of whether those nudges should be directed in particular ways towards particular behaviors. The examples given of sort of paying tax on time speak to simplicity and a clarity that makes sense, but whether nudges should be enforced in different directions for more moral behavior or more kind of communal behaviors that have wider spread changes for society, and who gets to push those things in particular directions. There's lots of interesting questions raised by it.
I mean, in some sense, we're all in the nudging game. Any parent is in the nudging game, right? Where they're trying to persuade their child, certainly their teenager, to do something, and they know there's a right or a wrong way of saying it. But what we can also say, I think, there are a lot of things which there's generally kind of agreement. You know, no one enjoys paying their taxes, but you don't want to pay your neighbour's taxes. And if it turns out, for example, to make this a real example, we found adding a line saying most people pay their taxes on time, or most people in your area pay their tax on time, you're one of the few to do so, led to a 15% increase in the payment in the month following for late taxpayers with no further prompt. In fact, in this case, you're underestimating how moral your neighbours are, which is a general bias. We overestimate bad behaviour in other people, and correcting that, leading to that effect. So it's very few people, I think, have violent objections to that. In fact, it seems a pretty nice and sensible thing to do. But that doesn't mean to say there wouldn't be use cases where we think, am I sure?
Absolutely. So, I mean, from the acronym that the nudge unit uses, EAST, it should be easy, attractive, social, and timely. That social aspect, the effect of peer pressure. One of the questions I'm thinking around here is, who gets to be the peers? So we see these kinds of influences, these nudges on communities, and it works at this large scale level, but also at much smaller scale levels in digital communities. Some of my research looks at that actually the question of who is presenting the message, what kind of access to epistemic capital they have, what kind of charismatic authority they have, and what kind of messaging they're doing. We see examples where nudging leads to behaviors that actually is against the public good. So sort of anti-mask conspiracism at the moment, or further back, I looked at anti-vaccination conspiracism. It's the same sort of influence. It's not a mystical process. It's been happening for centuries, as we say, but we're concerned, as you say, who's nudging the nudges, what direction those nudges go in. So it's interesting to see something that works kind of virally in the social media sphere also being implemented in policy as well.
Yeah, no, indeed. Well, if you go back to the parenting example, it's often one of the most important thing a parent can do is try and influence who the peer group will be. The peer group does the heavy lifting. And so you try and help your child choose good peers, right? Is that the role of government? A different question. But yes, it gets you into that space in broad terms.
What can be done about those who are arguing against vaccinations, the anti-vaxxers, from a nudge point of view? If they're using nudge against nudge, is it my nudge is bigger than yours?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we're seeing narratives being disseminated virally online about what is the truth and who has access to the truth. And if we can educate about the scientific basis of the actual limits and abilities of vaccinations, that would push back against that level of conspiracism. But again, the charismatic authority of particular individuals or groups of individuals who've formed societies and collectives is difficult sometimes to push back against, especially with that suspicious level towards government interference in those procedures and narratives. So the suggestion that government is doing something secretive and bad with vaccines, and the whole 5G conversation as well overlaps with that. So yeah, it's a difficult one to push back against online virality of ideas. But again, it's the same sort of process of nudging that we're seeing.
With me to discuss conflict, warfare and relationships are Professor Margaret Macmillan, Professor of International History at the University of Oxford and formerly Warden of St Antony's College, whose book, Paris 1919, is both a classic and a bestseller. Margaret also has a new book coming out shortly called War, How Conflict Has Shaped Us. Very fitting for the focus of today's discussion. And Dr. Ben Wilkinson, Director of Research in the Policy Institute at King's College, London, whose areas of research include defence, security, foreign policy, and, interestingly, mental health.
There is a large argument which goes on, and I don't think has reached a conclusion, that the need for aggression and the resort to aggression is deeply embedded in human nature. It may well be, and there's a lot of argument about that. That seems to me not to be directly relevant to war. War is actually controlled violence. It's not the sort of sudden lashing out that you might get in a fight outside a pub or between two people who've suddenly lost their tempers. War is probably the most controlled of human activities, which uses violence to achieve certain goals. And so I think war is very much tied up with organized society. Again, we will perhaps never know for sure because it's very difficult to go back into prehistory and collect evidence. But it does seem that once people began to organize themselves into groups, whether these were familiar groups, clans, or tribes, or even larger units, they began to have things they wanted to defend, including their own people. And of course, once they settled down and engaged in agriculture, they had things that they couldn't pick up easily and move. And so you begin to get war as human society, I think, becomes more organized.
But doesn't that suggest that if we're an organized society, war will follow?
I don't think it does, because if we're organized, we can also control violence. I mean, one of the great steps forward, I think, is when we began to get larger states that controlled violence within their borders. As Hobbes said, they got a monopoly of the violence within their borders. And this was, in fact, a way to produce a more peaceful society. I mean, if you think of what it must have been like to live before there was a strong state, when you were at the mercy of every local thug and bandit. I mean, we see what's happened in failed states today. I think it's very clear what happens when you don't have central authority. So no, I don't think war is a natural part of human society, but I do think it's deeply embedded in human society, and the growth and development of human society has been very much affected by war.
So Ben, help us out. Do you agree? And what's the difference between war being embedded in society and war not being part of the organisation of society?
No, I think I broadly agree with Margaret. I mean, there's this theory, isn't there, from people like Steven Pinker and so on, that since 45, the long peace has led to the sort of better angels of our nature coming through, helping us control our sort of base urge to fight with one another, and the number of wars and the number of people dying from wars has reduced dramatically. And he says, this is a part of a trend towards a sort of more peaceful society. It's the effects of society normalizing itself away from conflict and war. And there's a kind of big debate that goes on about whether that sort of is true or not. But certainly the idea that society should be able to sort of self-regulate against conflict and tries to do so is a powerful argument. In my view, that's the way that things are sort of going. I guess the question is what the wars of the future will be like and how they will change that, whether they will be more system-oriented wars or more people-oriented wars, whether you can sort of draw a trend from the last 40, 50, 60 years going forwards on that is a kind of critical question. A long history of conflict, it's focused on the individual human. But increasingly, I wonder whether wars will move on to systems. So you wipe out entire systems that humans rely upon now. Previously, things like agriculture have been the case, but now we're so reliant on things like the internet, on basic provision of services like that. And you can see that being able to capture or control those would be catastrophic.
We're talking about blame and responsibility this week, and let's face it, there's plenty to go round. My guests are Professor Bertram Marley from Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island, a specialist in social cognition, moral psychology, and human-robot interaction, and a regular contributor, Dr Kitty Alone, research fellow here at the Woolf Institute with specialism in the cognitive science of religion and morality and moral transference. Well, we're coming towards the end, and I'm going to give you each the opportunity to own up to some recent misdeed now, in a form of, you don't have to offer a confession, but, are you able to acknowledge a responsibility for some act for which you have rightly been blamed, or perhaps no one's blamed you at all?
Bertram, you first.
Sure. I would rather not admit to a misdeed without my lawyer present, but I'll tell you something that my wife and I have adopted. It's a practice that goes as follows. When we have an argument, and it could be about claims of fact, one says, no, it was 4 years ago. And the other says, no, that was 2 years ago. And we all know that we can get into these very confident statements and claims. What we have agreed to, and really do now quite reliably, is when then reality comes out, it was really 4 years ago. The one who was wrong, who wrongly, confidently claimed the other thing, has to say, you were right and I was wrong. And we literally have to use those words. And I'll tell you, it still stings a little to have to say that, but it is powerful because the other almost is invited immediately to forgive. And any kind of disagreement is just that, disagreement over facts. That can also be about somewhat more morally tinged and not just factual disagreements. So I think we really needed to practice that. It was not easy the first time. So whatever misdeeds there are, or what small disagreements there are, being able to say that and practice saying it, I think goes a little bit towards that reconciliation and also reinstating our own self-image, but still being able to admit.
Well, being completely blameless. Oh gosh, I'm sure I've mentioned this before, but when I was a teenager, I just passed my driving test. And I drove it out and I sort of, got really overconfident and tried to park it and ended up scratching my dad's new paintwork. I drove it home, parked it in the carport, and he saw it and inevitably went absolutely ballistic. And he thought he blamed my mum for doing it. He was, your bloody mother's done this again, blah, blah, blah. And I said nothing. I didn't own up. And to this day, I still feel guilty about it. Not guilty enough to actually tell her, though. But maybe if I just sort of go through the ritualized confession, maybe that'll alleviate some of my guilt rather than actually trying to make interpersonal amends. Who knows?
Kitty, you're pardoned. That's all for this week. Thanks to my guests, Bertram Marley and Kitty Alone. We'd like to hear from you at nakedreflections@woolf.cam.ac.uk. Let us know where we're going wrong or what we're getting right. If you'd like to catch up with our back catalogue, which includes episodes on Einstein, nudge theory, racism, and many, many more, you can find them and subscribe to the Naked Reflections podcast wherever you access your podcasts or at nakedscientists.com/reflections. I'll be back next week with some more guests.